what's up, FunAhead fans? Oh, hold on one sec here. So, this is a quick episode, kind of throwing it back a few months to when we had the Boxster's engine apart completely. I made an interesting discovery with regards to the IMS bearing that came in the 987 Boxster S. If you don't know what an IMS bearing is, basically it's a bearing inside the engine of certain generations of Porsche engines that if it goes bad, it will cause valve on piston contact and basically ruin your entire engine. I discovered something pretty interesting with regards to the IMS bearing that was inside the engine, and I was actually about to leave that bearing inside the car and let it run, and I'm pretty glad it didn't, and here's why. Well, I just discovered something quite surprising. I don't know if any of you eagle-eyed viewers caught that. If you look at that stamp right there, that says LN, or LN Engineering, which means that's not the original IMS bearing. In the process of getting new parts, I have decided that we're getting a new intermediate shaft bearing. Now I know what you're thinking, David, you said in one of the last videos that the intermediate shaft bearing is still the upgraded IMS Retrofit bearing from LN Engineering. And to that I would say you were exactly right. Unfortunately, I don't know when it was done in the vehicle's history. Unfortunately, there was about a 7-year lapse in any kind of history for the car other than registration history. So there was no maintenance history during that time, which, you know, obviously means that someone was either DIYing the work or that they were taking it to an indie shop that maybe just didn't report all of that data to Carfax. My hunch is that the IMS bearing was replaced sometime within that window. However, I can't prove that. But because I can't prove when it was done, and I don't know how many miles are on this car with this bearing, I'm just gonna go ahead and just renew it, because while we're in there, we might as well. We've got the whole freaking thing apart. We might as well just go ahead and do the IMS bearing too, because we're making everything else cherry. Why wouldn't we make that cherry? I know I've said this before, but I'm quite jealous of the next owner of this car, because seriously, this thing is going to be the most mechanically pristine vehicle on the road. So again, a lot of words, I know, but I'm just gonna go ahead and pull this IMS bearing out, and let's see how an LN Engineering IMS Retrofit bearing looks with an unknown number of miles on it. All right, so here it is. We have the IMS bearing out. But one interesting thing, you know, if you're familiar with these bearings, you are probably seeing what I'm seeing, in that this is the standard single row bearing with a more beefy stud. What? Here's the stock bearing that came out of my 996 911. This is the original single row IMS bearing. It had 94-ish thousand miles on it, so it was perfectly good. But when you look at the thickness of the bearings, it's the same. However, look at the stud, and the original stud was tiny. This bearing that came out of this Boxster had as we know, it had an LN Engineering flange, and this is the stock flange, in case you're curious what it looks like. And then here is the bearing that's going into it. It looks really weird right now because it's been in the freezer in preparation for being installed. So it's very frosty at the moment. But you can see the thickness difference here, because the IMS Retrofit is a double row that goes in the same place as the single row. So inherently it's a little bit wider. My initial thought was that this was just the stock bearing that had the grease seal pulled off of it. Regardless, it's a similar spec bearing. So obviously we're not sure whether or not this bearing that came out of this car was just the stock bearing, or if it was like a bearing that LN Engineering sold that was like similarly spec'd as the stock bearing, but it just had, you know, an upgraded center post and flange. So very long story short, it's very good that we're doing this, because even though I thought this car had the upgraded LN Engineering IMS bearing, it turns out it does not. We don't have the dual row ceramic bearing, but the tell for me should have been this circlip. So the stock bearing, because it's thinner, it goes inside here and is actually held in here by a circlip. Well, the upgraded dual row bearing is too thick for that, and the circlip cannot fit around. But of course I noticed that the circlip was still in place on this one, and I didn't put two and two together to think that, oh, hey, actually maybe this bearing isn't the dual row. Regardless, it is very good that we are going ahead and upgrading this bearing. Now we can go ahead, put the very robust dual row IMS Retrofit in place of the original bearing that we bought this car with, and the next owner can have peace of mind about the IMS bearing for a very, very long time to come. One thing I do want to do, however, is let's check the condition of this bearing. And as we said before, the bearing had really nice movement to it and it had no play, so it did feel very good, and I guarantee you we could have continued to run this car for a very long time. So one interesting thing is the back of the bearing here, what was on the actual inside of the shaft, is the amount of just rust and dirt that's on this thing. There was a lot of oil on the inside of this tube. I would say probably enough to fill it up, maybe not quite halfway. Like, a lot of oil came out of it. So that means that over time, even with this bearing having a back seal and it being perfectly sealed to this shaft, oil can still get through there and fill it up. Meaning that the old theory about how IMS bearings fail is very true. Oil can, in fact, get past these grease seals. If you have an engine that you run and dilute the oil in a lot of times, meaning you do very short drives to the grocery store and you get fuel dilution in your oil, and then you consistently just let that oil sit in your car, that fuel diluted oil can get into this IMS bearing and damage your rollers inside of it. If this is rusting up, it's not far-fetched to think that the inside of this bearing can also do the same and therefore be compromised. Well, cool. Fun story time with the IMS bearing. I'm going to go ahead and put the new one in, and we'll be good to go with regards to IMS bearings. And just like that, we've got our new LN Engineering dual row IMS Retrofit bearing installed into our intermediate shaft. We are good to go for many, many, many miles. You're welcome, next owner.